Ever since the release of the Xbox One and PS4, definitive editions of existing games have become increasingly common. These usually include the base game with all of the DLC released thus far, and since many of the games were making the jump between generations, it would also make sense to have improved graphics, right? Well, over time, the Definitive Edition tag has been used for everything from remasters with all of the content to glorified Game of the Year editions. So let's take a look at 6 games which sadly weren't all that definitive and couldn't hide the fact. Dishonored Definitive Edition. Arcane Studios' Dishonored debuted in 2012 for the Xbox 360, PS3, and PC, and despite arriving near the end of their life cycles, it made an impact. The stealth gameplay, multiple ways to approach missions, consequences that had far-reaching effects on the story, and so on established it as an excellent game. And it was all the more impressive that Arcane could deliver such a great experience with anti-aliasing, screen space ambient occlusion, and depth of field on essentially outdated hardware. So you would think that Dishonored Definitive Edition, which launched in August of 2015 for the Xbox One and PS4, would be a decent step up. No one expected remade visuals or heavily revamped assets, but 1080p resolution and 60 frames per second seemed a given. Unfortunately, despite launching 2 years after the initial game, which could hit 60 FPS or more on inferior PC hardware, Dishonored Definitive Edition was stuck at 30 frames per second. Image quality is better, for sure, but the large amount of FXAA blurred significant amounts of details. Texture streaming issues, the lack of anisotropic filtering, and other missing visual flourishes from the PC version did not help. Mafia 2 Definitive Edition. For many fans of the series, Mafia 3 failed to really live up to the quality of Mafia 2, whether it was in the overall gameplay or lack of polish, the game's technical state at launch notwithstanding. So when 2K Games recently announced a Mafia trilogy and Mafia 2 Definitive Edition was included, there was some excitement. It even included a full remake for the original Mafia. Who could refuse? As it turns out, a lot of people could have and should have. Mafia 2 Definitive Edition game runs at 1080p resolution, but cannot even maintain a stable 30 frames per second on the PlayStation 4 Pro. Frame rate drops along with texture pop-ins are incredibly common, making the game a chore to play, and the outdated gameplay, which wasn't refined, polished, or improved in any way, sticks out as much as the empty world. Keep in mind that the original game released in 2011. This 2020 remaster on superior hardware just barely looks better while delivering vastly inferior performance. A true feat indeed, but not the kind that deserves the title definitive. Metal Gear Solid 5 The Definitive Edition. Definitive Editions and Game of the Year editions are sometimes used interchangeably, with the basic appeal being the base game plus all of the content released for it, which is fine in and of itself for a Game of the Year package, never mind if said game actually won any Game of the Year awards. But when talking about definitive editions for a game, one expects an improved experience, if not some bonus content to go along with it. Metal Gear Solid 5 The Definitive Edition didn't offer any visual improvements when it released in 2016. Thankfully, it didn't have to. The game still looked stunning thanks to the Fox engine and offers some of the best stealth gameplay available. However, it's a repackaging of Metal Gear Solid 5 Ground Zeroes and Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain, along with the former's DLC and Metal Gear Online bonuses. But it doesn't include Episode 51, a non-playable mission included with the Collector's Edition that served as a more fitting and complete ending for the game. For all intents and purposes, this is most definitely not the most definitive Metal Gear Solid 5 experience. Sleeping Dogs Definitive Edition. Spare a thought for United Front Games' Sleeping Dogs, an excellent action-adventure with a strong open world and story set in Hong Kong and focused on the Triad. Despite selling over 1.5 million copies and seeing plenty of DLC, it more or less remained a one-hit wonder for Square Enix. Its spin-off Triad Wars was cancelled and forgotten. That being said, it's hard to muster too much sympathy for its Definitive Edition. The Definitive Edition marked the game's debut on Xbox One and PS4, with improvements also coming to PC, and collected all of its DLC into one package. United Front did tout improvements like fog and mist effects, redone lighting, some additional animation frames, animated lighting for neon signs, and so on. However, comparisons revealed that it wasn't that big of a step up from the original, and, like Dishonored, ran at a locked 30 frames per second on Xbox One and PS4. Again, if you expected 1080p gameplay with all of the content in one place and never played the Xbox 360 or PS3 versions, this might have been appealing, but for everyone else, it was just there. Mafia 3 Definitive Edition. If Mafia 2 Definitive Edition got railed on for barely offering any improvements and worsening the overall performance from the original, then Mafia 3 Definitive Edition takes things several steps further. Remember that when Mafia 3 first launched, it faced numerous performance issues and bugs. Many of those bugs weren't completely fixed, but at least the performance was in a fairly decent place. The Definitive Edition throws that completely out the window, causing frame rate drops and stuttering. Even more hilarious or sad is that it doesn't support 4K on the PS4 Pro and Xbox One X, while the original release did. If you owned Mafia 3 and updated to the Definitive Edition, enhancements for both consoles are removed. Have fun playing at 900p resolution on an Xbox One X, that too with very little Definitive Edition improvements. 2K Games confirmed that it was working to restore 4K support for both consoles, but how this even made it past initial testing while still being marketed as having full 4K support on the Xbox One X is baffling. Age of Empires Definitive Edition. Though it may seem like the least egregious of all the games on this list, Age of Empires Definitive Edition still had some major problems. Consider the passionate fan base behind this game, which expected gameplay improvements, if not fixes for old issues. The good news is that in terms of presentation, the 4K resolution upgrade and sound design changes were well done. Features like expanded population limits for multiplayer were also welcome. And this is all well and good, but the first Age of Empires released in 1997. In terms of differences between units and different civilizations, not to mention building complexity, there isn't much to be had. Even contemporary features like unit queuing, hotkeys, improvements for AI and pathing, and so on are notably absent. It also didn't help that at launch in February 2018, at least when playing from the Microsoft Store, the game would crash constantly for some, making it effectively unplayable in addition to other bugs and issues. It wasn't even available on Steam until August of 2019, so if you really wanted to scratch that Age of Empires itch, you had to go through the Microsoft Store for the Definitive Edition. On the positive side, Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition would release in the same year on Steam, and stands out as one of the finest strategy remasters currently available. So there is that. And that about does it for this video. If you enjoyed what you watched and want to see more from GamingBolt, you can always hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon next to it. That way you will never miss any of our videos.